before we get into tonight's piece, any questions about where we've been going so far? No. Materials that reflections I've been sending out.
It's a lot to absorb. It's not engineering thought.
No, it's in some ways it's not, but in some ways I think it's actually a lot easier to approach it fairly simply, and particularly with a lot of it, to not give it much time. Here's what takes a lot of time and can take a lot of brain energy and get you in sort of circles, and that is to consider why. You know, for example, you know, we talked about, you know, what makes you mad, and it's like you can spend a lot of time, why does this make me mad? And it's sort of, I think that's almost an irrelevant question. I think a much more helpful question is, what can I learn from it? And particularly what I've been really struck by is how a simple thing that gets us really frustrated can actually be a really powerful indicator of part of God's plan, that the whole idea of a prophetic sort of edge to our life and what we're about. So I wouldn't spend any time trying to figure out why you may be irritated by some small thing, or likewise why there are some things that you deeply love to do. I know we had that conversation, for those of you who were there on the Wednesday evening before Easter. I think of Kelly loving to walk, and why she might love to walk, I think, is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And actually, I would really ponder that I think that sort of love of walking may actually be part of her spiritual DNA. And it's just part of what's wired in. And it may have been reinforced over the course of life and different things, but I think its origin goes back a long way before that. And the same with these things that irritate us. And some of them can be really quite funny, and yet incredibly profound. And I don't remember, did I tell you guys the story of the lady who the toilet seat being left up drove her crazy? Did I tell the story before?
No,
I don't remember anyway.
I don't remember that story.
I don't remember.
You probably remember it. It was.
I would remember
that. It was. We were doing the thing, and this was with a group of pastors, and there was about 50 of them all. They're in a doctoral program, and this one lady, and we're talking about what do they love to do, and then we say, okay, now what drives you really crazy? What gets you really mad? And she says, you know, what really gets me mad is when my husband lifts the toilet seat up. And I said to her, so, okay, so what's the value that's being violated there? And she ponders it for a moment. And then she says, you know, I feel taken for granted.
Mm-hmm.
And then her eyes literally got as big as saucers. And she's a pastor who's been in ministry for quite a long time. She's sort of coming back doing a DMin. And her eyes just got as big as saucers. And she said, that's what I preach. That's, and if you listen to preachers, most of us only have one sermon. We just preach it 52 different ways a year. And so it's kind of like we have a gospel, and that's why we are in her gospel. In a sense, her message is not to take God for granted. So this kind of thing that you could almost laugh about, and she was laughing about, but it just really irked the heck out of her. And yet I think it was, well, clearly it was very profound in terms of illustrative.
That's actually Rob, that's actually a necessary component, I think, to the spiritual life, is actually to be able to have a sense of humor, not the cruel type of what we've come to understand as humor, but to be able to laugh, not only at the absurdity of folk and the way we go about things, but also at ourselves, being able to go, that's kind of funny that this is the one thing that's really ticking me off.
Well, no, and I think that's a big part of the mischievous way, and that capacity to laugh at one another, and actually not at, but with one another, and to laugh at ourselves. I think that capacity to tease, which I think Jesus was teasing Nicodemus, in that whole story about being born again. This is a professor and he's not getting it, and that a big piece of it is to tease, and to get sort of Nicodemus not to take himself so seriously. And I think that ability to laugh is really important, and that capacity also needs to be set free from the ego, because if it's not, then it becomes sarcasm, and sarcasm, the origins of that word is kind of interesting, because sark is flesh and chasm is to tear, and
Rip
I
the
think
skin off.
and so it's, people will say, well, I was just joking, and it's like, well, the heck you were, that really hurt, and I think it's because they have really torn flesh. But I think it's also,
I wanted to quickly interject that I once left the toilet seat up, and my mother fell in. So the perspective on this ought to be a little more sensitive to the opposite sex, because the male sex never really thinks about the toilet seat. So when there's somebody that you care about and then they suffer because of a stupid thing you do, that I think human beings need to you need to think twice about. There are consequences. They're agreeing with me. There are consequences to thoughtless action.
Well, I think part of what we've got there is that sense, and I think this is, part of what we're learning really in terms of the virus, and it is that things like wearing a mask and staying at home and doing all of these activities is not just about me and my safety, it's about caring for one another. And that this is, and it was kind of quite striking to me. I don't know what people's experience has been in terms of traveling across the country, or when you do happen to go out, but I've noticed that when I was traveling across the country, very few people were wearing face masks, which I found really surprising. And what's interesting to me about the whole face mask research, or what I'm learning, is that the face mask is not simply to protect yourself, and in fact, it's not all that good at just simply protecting yourself. it's actually much better at protecting others if you happen to be infected. And particularly as people will shed the virus for 2 or 3 days prior to sort of developing symptoms in many cases. So I think things like face masks, washing your hands, just some of these simple things, staying at home, are an expression of this caring for others. And I know that that's awareness of other is, you know, when I mentioned in one of the emails how people stopping in the middle of a crowded jetway to answer or to do a text message, just for some reason, it's like I could almost go on a campaign to smash every cell phone in the universe.
And I mean, it really goes back to, you know, one of the things that we would, you were talking about sense of humor and being mischievous and so forth. In the monastery, one of the things that we would oftentimes say is, if you don't love the brother, then you shouldn't be the one to give him corrective information. And the same thing would be said with jokes, that if you don't love the person, you probably shouldn't be poking and making a joke or finding humor. Because chances are, if that's the case, then you're really, really engaged in that ripping of the flesh and sarcasm.
I'd agree, Joseph, and I remember when I think about that sort of the mischievous face of compassion, one of the things that my little rule for doing that, particularly since it's kind of a covert way of working with people, is that I won't go down that mischievous route unless I have found my place of delight in the other. And that, so if I'm teasing someone or being sort of paradoxical with them, then I need to be coming from a place of delight. I think of my grandmother who would get a twinkle in her eye. And so it's kind of, I think of having a twinkle in my eye when I work with people and do that kind of work. But yeah, I think you're right. If you're wanting to correct somebody, you need to have that place of delight or love, care, however you want to refer to it. But if you're just angry, it ain't going to work. It'll be destructive rather than constructive. Yeah. So,
Rob, what I took from your meditations this week is, and what drives that delight is a sense of courage and quiet confidence, and the ability to say, yeah, it's okay, and let's proceed. And let's proceed in confidence and knowing that the Lord our God has got this. And therefore, those who don't have it yet, let's give them the ability to embrace it. And that's where that twinkle comes from, right?
Well, yeah, and I think
we sense that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. It's the time lag on Zoom, which it's kind of weird. I think that the piece there that Rob, that's important to me, and this is the Easter message.
Shut up.
That that no matter where,
I'm sure that was
the Easter message is that wherever we get to, or there is nowhere we can get to that is beyond God's capacity to redeem. And, you know, I think of, you know, the early explorers, you know, Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and all of these kind of guys, when they were sailing off on their voyages of discovery, one of their big fears was that, you know, believing that the world was flat meant that if they sailed too far, they could fall off the face of the world. And I think some Christians have that fear. There's a place they can get to where they would fall off God's capacity to redeem or to forgive or to care. And I was out on the prairie in Regina in Saskatchewan. I don't know whether any of you have been up on the Canadian prairie. It makes Nebraska look mountainous. It is like seriously dead flat. And the joke in Saskatchewan is if your dog decides to run away from home, you can watch it for 3 days.
That's awesome.
And I was puzzling why are people living here? Because I grew up in rolling green hills, trees, forests, and coast, and all of that kind of stuff. And it's like this Saskatchewan, and I was there first in the winter, and it was like seriously flat, no trees, nothing impeding your view of the horizon, and beyond boring. It was just like, this is seriously boring. And I couldn't understand why people would live there, and people had lived there their whole life. And I'm saying, why? What is it? And so I began asking the question, what's life-giving to you out here on the prairie? And it was fascinating. I also asked them the question, well, there was several answers I got. And when one of them I was saying, well, how does living here in the geography of the prairie inform your understanding of the nature of God? Because, I see rolling green hills and trees, and at the moment trees are in blossom and there are all sorts of flowers, the rhodies are blooming and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it's glorious. And that inspires me about God. And it's like, the prairie to me is almost God-forsaken. And what these folks had a profound sense that of the wideness of God's mercy, that there was nowhere you could get to beyond God's grace. Now, I think for some people, if you had a very punishing God, they may end up with sort of, there's an idea, there's nowhere you can get to that God can't find you and beat up on you. But this group of people are Anglicans that I was working with, and that certainly wasn't their God, but it was like there was nowhere that was beyond redemption. And so and that's the Easter message. You think about it, humanity executed, killed God's Son. And I don't think God planned for Jesus to die on the cross. I don't think that was God's plan. But I do think it provided an opportunity for God to demonstrate that God will always have the last word, and it's going to be a word of life, and it's going to be a word of love, and that there is nowhere we can get to that is beyond God's capacity to redeem. And I think that's Easter hope. And that confidence and assurance that you talk of, Rob, is based on that Easter hope. Now, I do know, it's kind of like Julian of Norwich, there's saying of hers that is often quote, all will be well, and all is well. Now, there are many times when people are distressed and suffering, I would not tell someone that, because I think that would be really insensitive, because clearly their perceived life experience is not that all is well. But it's also a profound spiritual truth. So how we use that truth, I think, is critical in terms of our sensitivity toward others and whatever they may be experiencing and suffering. But the point that I come back to, this God who raised Jesus from the dead also calls us by name. And even when we are on the edge of that cliff, ready to fall off the face of the earth, God is there, calling us by name. Joseph, you were going to say something.
Well, I was going to say that I call that the Easter danger. Because what I find in my, it's a good danger, but it's dangerous. It's risky. Because I find in my work, a lot of what I end up watching is a deconstruction of what we thought was God. So particularly with folks who are HIV positive, for example, or young gay men when they're and women when they're coming out, is there's this fear that I'm gonna fall off the face of the earth, and to have that Easter danger, that I might fall off, but God will catch me, but really not having any clue that it will actually happen. That's Easter danger. That's Easter joy, because we had no clue that God was going to raise Jesus on the third day. We just watched him die. And then he was put into a tomb. And then Mary went weeping and turned around and heard him call her name.
Yeah,
I mean, that's Easter.
very much so. And I think that's the thing I've been pondering the last couple of Holy Weeks, the last couple of years, because I don't think Jesus knew that he was going to be raised from the dead in the way that he was. I think he did what he did, trusting that God would take care of him. But it makes, if he knew like what we know today, it would kind of make the whole Garden of Gethsemane a bit of a nonsense. And most of our experience of suffering is because in that moment we do not see the Easter solution, and that's why we suffer. And Jesus walked that path, lived it, prayed it in the garden. And yet it's kind of the same thing with what he said to the disciples when he'd said some tough things, and he said, okay, are you going to leave too? And I think it was Peter who said to him, where are we going to go? Where are we going to go? You've got the words of life.
We've kept a lot with you.
So any questions about what we've done so far? Because I'm going to give you all a homework project. It's a little bit more detailed.
I was just going to add that this ties into last week's sermon. We had hoped.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, and I think no, I think that's totally right. And what Kelly was saying, that whole sense that we have put our hope in this Jesus, but I'm not sure that they fully understood. Peter clearly didn't understand. And I think the whole Peter story is of the person who never understood. At least till the Acts of the Apostles when the blanket came down 3 times, and then he and Paul had to go to set to, because for Peter particularly, Messiah was something very Jewish, and that it was really about tossing Romans out of Jerusalem. And he was hoping for a new Jerusalem, a new day when the Jewish order would be in charge of Israel. And Jesus didn't come to boot Romans out of Jerusalem. He came to set us free and to give us life.
He came to boot out our egos.
Yeah.
To evict them.
Or help us to realize that they actually don't exist. They're a delusion.
Exactly.
Because, it's kind of interesting because you can't actually get rid of an ego. Because if you're able to say, I got rid of my ego, then there must be a bigger ego inside of me that got rid of the other egos. So it's sort of like the whole point of surrender is to be able to let go and to realize that ego doesn't actually exist. It's an illusion. And yeah.
May I ask 2 questions?
Yeah, go for it, Van.
One is you'd said something about Peter never understanding until he and Paul did something, and I just wasn't sure what that meant. And the second question is about Jesus didn't really know that he would be raised from the dead. He thought that God would take care of him in some way, but I had the impression that he was using language to say that he would ascend and sit on the right hand of the Father, meaning he would ascend to heaven. And I never really have understood what that means, but maybe we could I just want to make sure I understand what you meant.
Well, I think part of, when I look at the Gospels, a lot of the things that are attributed to Jesus, that Jesus said, I would actually wonder whether that's actually a literary style. And that I think particularly of some of John's statements about Jesus, that these are really John's understanding of who Jesus was in the light of his death and resurrection. And so that John is putting some of those words into Jesus' mouth. They would be consistent with the ultimate reality of what we know, but were they actually what Jesus specifically said while he was, well, and he would be an example. One of the passages, I think it's John, he would say, unless you take up your cross and follow me, you're not worthy to be called my disciples, or something to that effect. Now, if Jesus had said that before the crucifixion, which supposedly he did, that would have made absolutely no sense, because the cross hadn't happened. They're going, what's he talking about, cross? But it's only in the light of that, and we would say, and Jesus said a lot of things about surrendering our life, letting go of, now this is our language, letting go of ego to follow him, letting go of mother and father and following Jesus. That whole following piece clearly is a giving up. And so that expression to take up your cross, you could clearly see Jesus saying that after the resurrection, but it wouldn't have made sense to me, is the way I read it, prior to his death. So that's part of the way I think of in terms of some of the gospel things. The other issue with Peter and Paul was really about what are we to do with these Gentiles? For Peter, all the way through Peter's understanding, whenever Jesus hung out with Gentiles, crazy stuff happened. And Peter would get really offended by Jesus sort of hanging out with the Gentiles. It was like Messiah's coming for the Jews. And when they, one of the times when Jesus was hanging out with the Gentiles, like there's the storm breaks out and they're in the boat coming back, I think from Capernaum or somewhere. But this kind of weird stuff happens, or Peter gets offended. And it's kind of not right. Jesus, I think of the Canaanite woman, where Jesus is calling her a dog and all of that kind of stuff. My guess is actually that's probably what Peter thought, because that's what Canaanite women were. They were dogs. And so Peter gets continually challenged whenever Jesus hangs out with the Gentiles. And that's why, even after the in Acts of the Apostles, the blanket comes down 3 times with the unclean food. And then there was the problem. So, okay, we got all these Gentiles who are believing in Jesus. What are we going to do? Do they have to be circumcised and obey the law like we all have to do? And that was the big Pauline argument with, and particularly with Peter. It was like, for Paul, Jesus was the universal Messiah of all of humanity, not just the Jewish folk. And that, now it's kind of like if you think of the garden story, and it's an incredible metaphor about human existence. In lots of ways, it's a story that was told by some Jewish folks, but it's a story about universal human experience. And this Messiah we have come to believe in is not just a Messiah of the Jewish people. This Messiah is the Messiah of all of humanity. And in a few weeks' time, we're going to celebrate Ascension Day, which for me is and a culmination. And so it comes back to your other question about sitting at the right hand of the Father. I think that's a metaphor as opposed to some, but it expresses the intimacy, and we can get into the whole Trinitarian conundrum, but it's the intimacy that Christ, I think when Christ is sitting at the right hand of the Father, Christ is then one with the Father. And that's an incredible metaphor. To me, the ascension is the culmination, and I understand St. Peter's doesn't have typically we haven't had an Ascension Day service. And there are 2 things that I do. And most of the time, as an interim, my whole thing is to join people where they are and to do the kind of worship they do and to enter into the world. So if they're low church, I'll be low church. If they're high church, I'll swing the incense. I'll sort of endeavor to blend into what the people are doing. But there are two things that I will do, regardless of what the congregation that I go to does. One of them is the 3 hours on Good Friday. If you want to find me, I'll be in church. And I wasn't in church this Good Friday, but I was in my house from noon till 3. That's what I do. You won't find me anywhere else. And I will meditate on those last 7 words. And I've done it in the church, in lots of places. And I really don't care whether anyone comes. It's like, if you want to come, come. If you don't, that's okay. It's what I do. The other thing I do is Ascension Day. And so we will be doing an Ascension Day service. We're looking at it, putting it together. And the reason I think the Ascension is so important is that we have in the incarnation, the story, which begins at Christmas, that God came and lived as one of us. And to me, that is profoundly important. That I do not pray to a God who does not understand what it's like to be hungry, what it's like to be thirsty, to understand what it's like to be betrayed, to understand what it's like to face death, my own mortality, everything that I can imagine as a human being, the suffering and the turmoil that we experience in our human life. I worship a God who knows firsthand what that is. And so I think that's where I would go back and wonder about the whole, because some would say that Jesus knew he was going to be raised from the dead. I really wonder about that from the perspective of the incarnation and the way that we would, we have a belief that we will be raised from the dead. I believe that. I haven't been there yet to prove it. And so there's that. Am I totally 100% convinced? Nope. But I am totally, I think, pretty well 100% convinced that I did not ask to be born and that I'm on somebody else's trip, living, that there is a bigger plan to my existence, and that whatever is on the other side of the grave is actually above my pay grade. That is God's business, and that I can trust God for whatever that is without having to know exactly what it is. Are there going to be streets of gold and all this kind? I really, really don't care. That's all sorts of interesting metaphors, but I didn't ask to be born. My very existence is God's idea, and I can trust God with my death. And I think that's what I sense in Jesus. But the other piece, though, that's the incarnation for me. But here's the other incredible good news to me, is that the whole story of the ascension is that our humanity, the essence of your and my humanity, is now in the heart of God. And that's what the ascension means. Humanity is now in the heart of God. And that God understands your and my human experience. And to me, that's really quite profound. And I love the Pauline expression that our lives are hid with Christ in God. I think that's the ascension. And I think the other big piece of what that means to me, and this is where I would part company with a lot of both Catholic and Protestant theology, where we talk about original sin and total depravity of humanity and all of these kinds of things. I will say, nah, there's something that goes before that, and it's original blessing. And I've been sort of talking about that, and I know Matthew Fox has written a whole bunch of stuff on that. But I think that's, in this, I can remember being taught that humanity and divinity could not coexist. There was a void between them. And sort of Jesus has got one arm on the cross and the other arm out this way, and he's got humanity over here and he's got God over here, and somehow he's bridging this gap because humanity is so depraved and defunct that it cannot coexist with God. And I think the ascension says, nah, it's this. Humanity and divinity are here, and that you and God are inseparable. And this whole idea that you are inseparable from God, beyond God's grace, so to speak, that is a lie. That is the big lie, and that humanity and divinity actually exist together. And that's the ascension. That's the part of, to me, why the ascension is so important. So we'll be celebrating the ascension. Well, I will be, and you're all warmly welcome to come and share in it.
Amen. We'll be there.
I think of when I think of the ascension and crucifixion in the garden, is the ascension is love given without the expectation, or it's the culmination of love given without the expectation that it will be reciprocated.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the sense of part of what happens when we fall in love with someone, be it a spouse or child, is that love is given whether or not they return it. That's perfect love.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus in the garden is saying, I love you, God, Father. And I love these people. And I don't know what you're going to do, but I love.
Yeah.
Whether or not that will be returned or not. So that's the human speaking. And then comes Easter. And I think Jesus goes, yeah, all right. And then there's the ascension, which is, yes, that's the bow.
Uh-huh.
That
it's sort of,
God says, yes, I absolutely give this love in return.
It's kind of like a blessed reunion, the ascension.
It's exactly. It's a blessed reunion. That's exactly right.
Two loves come together. I think of that love being poured out. It's like the river that flows, whether anyone's there to scoop the water out. It's there. It's just continually being poured forth. And
it's interesting because I mean, like the garden is the place where lovers go.
Mm-hmm.
It's a place of intimacy. And so there's this intimate moment, and then this God's response.
Well, and the thing the resurrection was a couple of years ago. My beloved Kim, she she and I and a group of other people, actually, we did the 3 hours together in one church, and we each took one of the meditations. And one of the things she said in the meditation, her meditation, was that God would always have the last word, and that would be a word of love. And I think that's, to me, the resurrection, and that no matter where we get to, God is always going to have the last word. You and I don't get it. And I remember doing a funeral for a guy who had been, actually, the family had said to me, this is going to be pretty tricky, Rob, because Dad wasn't a nice guy. And I refused to sort of do a funeral with lots of platitudes. And so, it was kind of, and one of the things that really made this guy difficult to live with was that he always had to have the last word. And so in this funeral, I joked with the family that today we're going to get the last word. But then to go on and say, but even then, we don't get the last word, do we? God gets the last word. And that it will always be a word of love. So here's the piece of the homework piece for this coming week that I'd like you to engage in and invite you to engage in. And I'm going to send it out to, let me just get it. Now, were all of you in the YES program? Before Easter, I started the YES program on Wednesday nights, and most of you signed up with an email address. Were you all on that, or was somebody not?
I think, was Bob and Marilyn in that?
Would have been the beginning of March.
Yeah.
Bob and Marilyn, can you guys put in the chat your response?
It was on March 11th. That was yes to God, yes to your neighbor, and yes to yourself.
Yeah. Okay, let me just go and get a piece of paper.
Don't you love how he took St. Peter's with him all the way to Portland?
Yes.
What was that?
Love that you took St. Peter's with you all the way to Portland.
On the wall there? Yep.
Your air vent moved.
Your air vent moved.
Not that anyone
That
was
was
noticing.
me. I'm off camera. I'm over here.
Your air vent moved. That is, talk about observant.
Sorry, there's an engineer in the background.
Here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out an email, and it'll, to the folks who have been on the program, and I've got your email addresses, you'll get this directly. Others who aren't on the call and who are interested, it'll be up online on the website tomorrow, and it's basically an interview where you'll spend about half an hour interviewing somebody. And here's the question I have. Couples could interview each other. You could also find somebody else if you've got nobody at home to interview. But the questions are basically to actually tell stories around the questions that I've been asking, to think about a time when you've been at your very best, to think about a time when you're doing what you love, what gets you mad, and what do you deeply value, and what do you hope and dream for the world.
Do you guys want to receive that email?
Um,
Hey, do y'all want to receive that email? Okay, got it. Thanks. All right, bye-bye. Okay.
And so what, rather than just something happens inside of us when we actually tell stories about those questions, rather than just think about them or gather data. So it's kind of like, what do I value? Is that what we're looking for is the story that goes behind it. And this is a large part about, our faith journey. What's the gospel? Well, ultimately, the gospel really is a story. It's about this incredible story of God and God's love, particularly as it was made known to us in Jesus. But it's also how our story gets blended with that. So pairing up and interviewing one another becomes important. And here's the question I have for those of you who are on your own. Do you want me to pair you up with somebody, or is there somebody on the call that you would like to interview? I'm just have a question about how we're to go forward. And that wasn't a rhetorical question.
Marilyn.
I'm sure Mr. and Mrs. Hoyerman will be happy to interview one of them.
How about you, Van?
The two people I know on this call are Kelly and Lita. I think the Sarah has dropped off, but those are the two people I know.
Uh-huh.
So I'm glad to participate with either.
So would you and Lita like to pair up and call each other and interview each other? I don't want to put anyone on the spot, and feel free to say no.
No, that's fine with me.
Cool.
Good.
And Rebecca's iPad. Who's behind? Who's Rebecca? Hey, Rebecca. Are you there?
Hello.
Uh-huh.
Wait a minute, let me turn it up. I can't hear.
Okay, I can.
Okay.
Would you like to engage in the interviewing piece?
Yeah, I'm gonna probably do a friend or.
Uh-huh. Yep. Cool. I'll send out here's what I'll do. I'll send it out tomorrow, and you can find, and even if the person hasn't been on the call, if you want to interview them, get them to interview you. And part of it is just to have the experience of telling your story. That's the important piece there. So the big question for me, and I'm just paying attention to time as well. The piece that will be I mentioned when we were talking is that our very existence is God's business. I mean, I didn't ask to be born, and I'm not sure that any of you did. Now, I get very cautious asking that questions around Mormons because they have a whole bunch of theology around that. So, but I certainly can't remember asking to be born. But I am very curious as to what God's plan was. And that's the way I've discovered as to how to figure that plan out is to actually go back and reflect on those things, particularly those times when we are at our very best. And as it said on one of the emails, that when we're at our very best, that is when we most closely approximate the image of God that God created us to be. And so if we want to discover God's plan, what we want to do is go back and find ourselves, particularly at those times when we're in our zone.
Necessarily.
What's that?
Sorry, I didn't realize that I was responding to a question and I thought I was on mute. Bob and Marilyn Evans just asked if husband and wife have to be separated, and I was replying with my audio saying in the chat, not necessarily. Sorry about that.
Actually, I'm okay either way. I'm
muted.
I think one of the things that couples may even discover is, I hadn't realized that. And particularly in some of maybe the stories, the specifics. So it would be entirely fine for a couple to do it. And it would be entirely fine to find somebody else. And one of the plans, we'll be doing a variation on this when we get back together in person and as part of the search process, because what we'll be looking at is to discover St. Peter's at its best and to discover in those stories what's God's purpose and what has been God's purpose, and to be able to articulate that, particularly as we look forward in terms of thinking about what we want to do as the congregation of St. Peter's, what do we want to become, and then what do we need in a rector to help us do that and become that. So we'll be doing a different version of this once we are able to get back in person, possibly in June. But just an FYI on that, raised the subject, we will, even though the governor has relaxed some of the rules, we as a congregation will not be open, the church will not be open during May. So the soonest we could be back in our worshipping together and would be in June, and exactly how to make sure that it is safe for everyone still hasn't been decided. And we need more hard data in terms of infection rates and all of those things to make those decisions. And so
May I comment on the process?
Yeah.
I have the impression that from your vantage point, that focusing on in what circumstances one is at his or her best is a direct way of getting closer to what you're looking for than focusing on sadness and what makes you mad and frustrated. That is I thought I understood you to say early in tonight that that's a way of approaching it, but it's less direct and less productive. And I like the idea. There is so much sadness in the world today, and there's so much despair in so many ways. if I think your idea of focusing on where you are at your best, and that's where God means you to be, and you're closest to God. I think that's in a half hour. You only have so much time to get at something. Otherwise, you can be all over the lot. And I would like to, Lita, I would like to approach this from the most positive way that we could. And I don't know how much you can get done in a half hour doing this.
I think you'll find you can get a whole lot done. I think what's interesting to me is that I would agree with you, Van. I would look particularly at what you're doing when you're at your very best. What do you love to do? The simple pleasures of life, which are often related to when you're at your best. People who, and I think I mentioned Kelly. She loves to walk, and some of her best pastoral experiences are when she walks with people, and that's metaphorically, but in some ways maybe literally true. I've known clergy who, I think I mentioned, who quilt sermons, cook sermons, help people ride a bike through the scriptures, in all sorts of different ways. To think about those things when you're at your best. I think the simple things particularly that make you mad are often kind of a prophetic edge to what you love to do and how you can do it. And I think the other piece of it is that what you love to do and how you can do it can also be a way to respond to the suffering that we see. So the thing that makes us sad, rather than focusing directly in on that, that'll just get you sad. But I think if you can figure out kind of your core purpose, then you will be able to see what piece of this world's suffering is part of God's plan in terms of your life. And I think you'll also discover, you'll be able to look back and say, aha, that was what was going on back then. Even maybe you weren't even aware of it. And I can think of several examples where I was totally oblivious, but clearly there were times when I was in my zone being Rob, and they were very godly moments without even having to think about it. And that's particularly what I'm looking for. Okay, folks, I don't want to keep you any longer. I'm happy to answer questions and talk, but I'll send that
I have
out.
a question.
Uh-huh.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I wrote down, I was taking notes, and we were talking about Jesus and agreed that he came to boot out our egos. And then I wrote, point of surrender is to realize that ego doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I wrote that correctly.
I think you wrote it very correctly.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
Well, now,
I love those you sinners. Leaders, women, you.
Huh?
Go ahead. I'll be quiet.
Here's the interesting thing about egos, and this is part of it is, if you read people like Thomas Merton, and a lot of the spiritual writers, they will talk about the true self and the false self. That the true self is this God-given you, that is egoless, and the false self is the ego. It's who you think you have to be in order to get along, all of that kind of stuff. And I have a problem with the labels true and false self, largely because it evokes sort of pejorative thinking, and that's just my false self, and then I have to get rid of my false self and all of this kind of stuff, which if you try and get rid of your false self, you've got to have a bigger false self to do it, which just is crazy making. and even our egos, I'm not in a sense opposed to having an ego. And my beloved Kim has written and thinks a lot about this and is writing about this whole sort of false self, true self. Her language for it is she calls the ego, and we would call the false self, our constructed self.
Mhm.
By that, it's kind of like, this is the self I have had to become to exist in the
Mhm.
world and to get stuff done. And this constructed self is partly what I've constructed, but it's also what other people have constructed for me. You know, sort of, I was raised to think certain ways. You know, it's like if you were to use a software metaphor, it's kind of, we think of, you know, you buy a computer, you're born with, you know, an incredible computer, but it's got very few software programs, doesn't have many apps, and our parents install a bunch of apps before we even have any say so. And then over the course of our life, we get to upgrade some and maybe delete some and what have you. But that's kind of the constructed self. You know, it's like we have become who we think and who other people have thought that we are. And a constructed self is necessary to navigate this constructed world that we live in. But there's another world that we also live in, and it's called the kingdom of God. And what's known in the kingdom of God is not the constructed self, but the self that we really are. And it is discovering who that self is. And one of the examples about, and this would go back to sort of Anne's question about when you're at your very best, and if you reflect on those experiences, and it's like you may walk away from a situation going, yeah, that was really cool. But it's really interesting because it's not a puffed up, arrogant, I'm the greatest kind of experience. There's also a real sense of humility and a profound awareness that when you're at your very best, you are part of something far greater than yourself. You may have been incredibly wise, but you were also part of a wisdom that was bigger and sort of beyond yourself. And I think it's those experiences we're looking for. It's not a negation of self, but it is the full awareness of a self that is fully in God and manifesting the divine life that's within us. And so that's a big part of what I'd be looking for in those conversations. And they may be and I think you'll discover them in the very simple things. Times when we've been at our best, being creative, caring, that have just left us with a profound sense of satisfaction. And that satisfaction is a satisfaction in who we are, but it's also a profound satisfaction in the one who created us. And so that's what I'd be inviting you to explore. So I will send that interview protocol out, some instructions, and look forward to hearing how it goes next week.
Good night, everybody.
Hey.
Good night.
Good night.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a good week.